Hello, in this video I'm going to show you how MIDI and MIDI controllers work. I'll teach you in detail everything about the MIDI protocol, its different types of messages, like what is a note on, note off, control change, pitch bend, etc. and how you can use MIDI with your MIDI controller. I'll show you how to configure and use different types of MIDI controllers, such as a traditional keyboard launchpad like the Akai MPK Mini, a control surface like the Ableton Push, and a DIY MIDI controller I made myself. So let's get started. So welcome to the Nerd Musician, my name is Gustavo Silveira, and today I want to clarify a lot of things that are in the day-by-day of a music producer or a musician. Today I'll teach you everything you need to know about MIDI and MIDI controllers. So expect to be able to know how to use your MIDI controller by the end of this video. And this subject can get very technical, so I'll try to not get too nerdy here. So what is MIDI? MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. MIDI is a protocol or a language that was created to make communication easy between different musical instruments from different brands, or from the same brand. So imagine, you live in the 70s and you have different synths, keyboards, and modulars from different brands. You'd have a hard time using the hardware of one with the sounds of other, for example, like we do today. That's why in 1983 at the NAMM conference, a group of really smart people decided to create a way of connecting all these different instruments through one unique language, through one unique connector. That's how MIDI was born, and the 5-DIN connector was used as a standard to transport MIDI messages between the instruments. So MIDI became the one language that all musical gear would have to speak. Then MIDI became huge and started to be used not only by instruments, but also by music software such as DAWs like Pro Tools, Logic, Ableton Live, and today you can even find MIDI being used in video editing software to control lights, etc. So, to summarize, MIDI is just a standard protocol that's used by musical instruments, software, etc., so they can communicate with each other. MIDI has no sound at all, but it can contain information about how sound should be played by a synthesizer, for example. And the MIDI controller is just an interface that uses the MIDI message, like keyboards, launchpads, mixers, etc. But more about MIDI controllers later. Now that you know what MIDI is used for, let's talk about the MIDI message structure. Okay, you bought a MIDI controller and you read that it's velocity sensitive, keys have aftertouch, and you can map its knobs with control change or CC, but what do those terms even mean? Now, I'll explain to you what is most important related to the things you most use, but keep in mind that MIDI can be way more complex and be used for lots of other things, okay? So the MIDI message is sent in packages. Each package contains 3 containers, or bytes. So each message is made by 3 bytes. 1 status byte and 2 data bytes. The first byte, called status byte, contains the MIDI channel and the type of MIDI message. A note on channel 1, or control change in channel 7, or pitch bend in channel 2. More about the different types of message later. And the second and third bytes are data bytes, which can contain information on how that message should be executed. So one MIDI message or package could be a status byte of channel 1, note on, and then a data byte with the note number, and then another data byte with the velocity. For example, a note on channel 1, playing the note 36, which is the same as a C, with velocity 64. So you can see that the note on message can be used to play notes in your synth or virtual instrument. Or you can have another type of message. You have your status byte, channel 3, control change, and your data byte with CC number 11, and another data byte with CC value 100. And you can use CC to control a volume, for example, because you can change the CC value continuously. And you'll see more about it in practice later. So for each type of status byte, we're going to have two specific data bytes. For example, the note on and note off messages will be always followed by the note number and note velocity, while control change by the CC number and by the CC value. And the really important thing, the MIDI message has a resolution, or a minimum and a maximum value. The MIDI channel ranges from 1 to 16. You only have 16 available MIDI channels, and the data message like note number, velocity, CC number, CC value, etc. range from 0 to 127. There's a reason why they have this resolution or range, but I promised I was not going to get so nerdy here. So you just have to believe me. Before we go deeper into the types of MIDI messages and how to use them, let's summarize what we learned so far. We learned that MIDI is only a protocol or a language, which can be used as a communication between different instruments, software, interfaces, etc. We learned that the MIDI message has 3 containers or bytes. The first contains the MIDI channel from 1 to 16, the MIDI message type, like note on or control change, and the next 2 data bytes contain a value from 0 to 127, which will tell how that MIDI message should be executed. An example could be control change at channel 1 with CC number 10 with CC value 100. Okay, so let's see how MIDI works in practice. For that, we'll need a MIDI controller. There are many types of MIDI controllers, and what all of them have in common is that they can use the MIDI protocol. There are keyboards, launchpads, control surfaces, mixers, and DJ controllers. You can even make your own the way you want, which I teach you how to do it, link below. But more on that later. Which MIDI controller you are going to get really depends on what you need, but they're pretty similar in the way they work and how you set them up in your DAW. Today I'm going to show you 3 different examples: the Akai MPK Mini, the Ableton Push, and a DIY MIDI controller I made. Each DAW will be slightly different, but if you understand the concept of how to use a MIDI controller, it's just a matter of doing some little research on how to do it in your DAW. Today I'm going to show you how to do it in Ableton Live. The Akai MPK Mini is probably the most popular MIDI keyboard right now, and by the way, I have a complete review about it here in the channel. It's in the description. It has velocity sensitive keys, it has pads, knobs, it has a pitch bend, joystick, and a couple of other things. By the way, I am using a USB cable in this MIDI controller connected to my computer, but some MIDI controllers still use that 5-DIN connector, which is the classic MIDI port, which you can have the MIDI out and MIDI in. So maybe you have an old keyboard and you still use the MIDI, the classic connector, then you're going to have to connect that MIDI cable to your audio interface if it has that type of connector, but nowadays everything comes with USB. So let's set up the Akai MPK Mini. Come to Live, Preferences, and MIDI. Here you should see the list of MIDI ports that you have in your computer. Some of them are virtual MIDI ports like this Yak driver, so never mind. But for example, I have my Audio Box 44 VSL, which is my audio interface. So if I were connecting my MIDI controller to my audio interface, I would select here, but you can see here that I have MPK Mini and in and out. The main things here are track and remote. To be able to play notes with your keys and pads, you need to select in. This way you can track your instrument. You can actually play, you can perform. But to be able to control things, for example, if you want to control a volume with your knobs, and if you want to, like, let's say, trigger a loop or control a mute or solo button, you need to select remote in input. Okay, so track is to play and remote is to control. Out is if you want to receive MIDI feedback in your controller, usually to control its LEDs. So let's select the track and remote too. Sync is to sync the tempo of your MIDI controller if you have a sequencer, for example, and MPE is if you're using a MIDI controller with MIDI polyphonic expression, like the Rolly C-board. But we're not going to use this right now, so let's leave it track and remote. Since we have track selected, we should now be able to play any synth here, so let's load a synth. Okay, so I just loaded my track here. So the other thing you need to make sure is that in MIDI from, you have or all-ins or the MIDI controller you are using, for example, the MPK Mini. And the channel, for example, you can see that it's sending on channel 1. So I can choose to listen to all the channels or only to channel 1. So for example, if I have another MIDI controller that's sending message in channel 2, I can only listen to channel 2 in that other track, and here only on channel 1. So this way you can route things up and select exactly what you want to listen here. So the other thing is that you have to arm the track, otherwise you won't play. Arm. And auto is just automatic, or if you select in, even if you're not armed here, you'll be able to listen. So in, it will be always monitoring. Auto only if the track is armed, and off, you'll never be able to listen to the track. So let's leave it in. So now let me open this software here called MIDI Monitor. So I can monitor the MIDI message that's coming. So I can select my MIDI controller here. So if I press a key, you can see here that it tells me the source, which is my MIDI controller, then the message, which was a note on, then the channel, which is channel 1, then the note number, then the velocity. So if I press the same key in different intensities, you can see that I get different velocities. And when I release the key, I get a note off. But what happens if I move my knob here? You can see here the channel, the type of message, which is control change, the control change number, and the control change value that changes in real time as I move the knob. But nothing happens here in the DAW. This is because we didn't map this knob to anything. So we have to understand the concept of MIDI mapping. MIDI mapping is assigning one part of your controller, like a knob, key, a button, to a parameter in your DAW. For example, to do that, press MIDI here or Command M in your keyboard or Control M if you're in Windows. Then click in the parameter you want to map and simply move your knob or press a key. And here you can see exactly what was mapped. And be aware that if you change the MIDI channel of your controller, you can use the same knob to control different things. Actually, you can map one knob or any component here to 16 different things because you have 16 different channels. So if you are in channel 1 here, you can map something. Then if you change to channel 2, you can map another something, and so on. Unfortunately, there's no easy way to change the channel here in the Akai MPK Mini. But for example, if you make your own MIDI controller, you can put a screen in the controller and buttons so you can change the channel and actually see in the screen what channel you are in. And I teach this in my course. So now I can actually map different things with different knobs. And once you're done, you press MIDI here again, and then you can move your knob and play notes at the same time. Another thing you can use is the pitch bend message, and this controller has a pitch bend joystick. Pitch bend is intended to bend the pitch of a note or a group of notes. However, the amount of pitch you bend is configured in the synth, not in the MIDI controller. So the MIDI message will only tell to bend the pitch as much as your synth allows. Another message you can find in keyboards is aftertouch, which sends continuous data depending on the pressure you apply on the key after you press them. So you press the key, And after you press the key, you can apply pressure, and this pressure will send a continuous value as a MIDI message as aftertouch. This keyboard doesn't have aftertouch, so I can't show you, unfortunately. Okay, so let's go to our next example, the Ableton Push, which is in the control surface category. The Ableton Push is a MIDI controller that is designed by Ableton to control Ableton Live. So what's the difference between this controller and a regular MIDI controller? It is made to be mapped automatically by the DAW. So instead of mapping each parameter manually, everything is mapped automatically, and things change on the fly as you move things around in Ableton. So here's how you set it up. I am connected through the USB cable, and we can come here to Live, Preferences, then MIDI. And now you have this option here, Control Surface, and you can browse through this menu through a list of controllers. So you can see here that you find lots of controllers that can be used as a control surface, even the MPK Mini. Actually, you can even make a MIDI script, that's how it's called, for your controller and add it here so it can be mapped automatically. But keep in mind that you can create a MIDI script that will make your controller to be mapped automatically by Ableton Live. And this process of using a control surface or even creating a MIDI script will vary from DAW to DAW, but know that it's possible to make a control surface out of your regular MIDI controller. Okay, so let's find here the Ableton Push. I have this one here, and put here in input and output the controller that we are using. Each control surface will gain different powers over Ableton, and it will depend on how the manufacturer or even you creates their MIDI script, a file that you configure and make your regular MIDI controller into a control surface. So let's take a look here in Ableton now. You can see here that we have our synth loaded, and I am going to delete all the mappings I made, okay? And see here that when I move the knob, it's all mapped. And I can play the keys here. And for example, if I move to another track, which I added a synth, now we can play this and probably change some parameter that was automatically mapped. And the push also have other things that are pretty useful, that you can trigger clips and launch loops and things that are dedicated to Ableton. And lastly, I'll show you that you can not only buy a MIDI controller, but you can also make one. So for example, I made this one to control the Moog app or any other synth, so I can have a dedicated controller for a plugin that I really like. And I can map the parameters I want to play like it was an actual plugin at my fingertips. And finding controllers like this is really hard. Plus, a huge bonus of making one is that it is super cheap to make it. This one here I spent around $50 here in Brazil. So let me just map quickly here and show you a quick example. Also, there's a complete video about this MIDI controller, the MidiMood, which I also left in the description. So if you're interested in making one, go check the Nerd Musician Pro course in the link below. Everything is really well explained there, and you can also subscribe for a free workshop where I'll teach you how to build your first MIDI controller. The workshop is totally free. Also, the links of all the products I mentioned here are in the description too. So today you learned that MIDI is only a protocol that contains information on how a synth or a device can play notes, alter timbre, move faders, etc. And the main MIDI messages we use are note on and note off, which contain the note number, which in MIDI is represented in numbers from 0 to 127, and also contain the velocity or intensity for that note. And a note on with velocity 0 actually is the same as a note off with any velocity. Actually, the velocity of a note off doesn't really matter. Also, we used control change. Control change, or CC, is used to control stuff. You can control a plugin parameter, like a volume or a filter, and you can also use it to control buttons like mute, solo, and etc. And there are other methods you use less, like aftertouch, pitch bend, program change, etc. And I left a couple of links here where you can learn more about the MIDI structure. But what I showed you here will get you covered in 90% of the cases. So, did you like this video? Did you learn something? So press that like and subscribe button. That helps me a lot, because it tells the YouTube I'm doing a good job and it helps its mysterious algorithm to share my video. So what do you want me to cover in the next video? Tell me in the comments below. Ciao!